Welcome to week 7, the final week here in our course TH205 Dispensationalism. This week, as we finish things up, concluding our reading in Charles Ryrie's Dispensationalism, we'll be looking at variant systems of theology. He touches on some of these at the end of his book. Progressive dispensationalism, notably, also ultra-dispensationalism or hyper-dispensationalism, as it's been called also. A little bit of deeper understanding of New Covenant theology. We're going to just look at the trends, the shifts in the theological world to see where people are, where they're lining up in the movement of the evangelical church, or just small groups within the church over the last century mainly, but we're going to look specifically at some current trends. And I would say that the current trends that we'll be looking at this week will include New Covenant theology and progressive dispensationalism primarily. There's not a whole lot of adherence to ultra-dispensationalism, but it's still something for you to be aware of. What you have here in this dispensational covenantal landscape is you've got dispensationalism on one side, and you've got covenantalism on the other side. And then you've got, kind of like you have in the political world, you have more or less this race to the center, what we'd call in politics a moderate conservative, and there's also radicals. And so we've got those on the opposite end of the spectrum as well. And so I want to paint that picture for you a little bit right now. As dispensationalism moves toward the center, that movement is known as progressive dispensationalism. It is a movement that has blurred the lines between Israel and the church. And as you remember, we've stated definitively that the indispensable components of a dispensational theology must include a recognition of the distinction between Israel and the church. If you lose that, you've really lost the sine qua non, the quintessential elements of what is dispensational theology. And that is what progressive dispensationalists have sacrificed in blurring the lines of distinction between Israel and the church, in their application of the new covenant to the church in this age. So there's been, like I said, the best comparison we could make would be to call, if they were conservatives, we'd call them moderate conservatives in this race to the center to try to have an open dialogue with covenantalists. Now, the covenantalist camp also has shifted. There is an emerging movement within the covenantalist camp of people moving toward new covenant theology, which also recognizes an emphasis on the new covenant that is distinct. They see something different in what the church participates in now in the new covenant than in the covenant with Israel of old. And so there is, again, a little bit of a middle ground there, something of a compromise. Now, on the further ends of the spectrum, what we would call radical, if you go beyond dispensationalism, you have an ultra-dispensationalism or a hyper-dispensationalism. As I said, that's not really common today, but it was much more common about 100 years ago. One of the proponents of hyper-dispensationalism would be Bullinger. And what you have there is such an extensive division of Scripture, or of the recognition of not only the dispensational changes, but even changes within a dispensation. Like, for instance, you've got the mid-Acts church, where rather than seeing the birth of the church at Pentecost, as we identified last week, they would go a step further and look at the birth of the Gentile church and see a distinction there that is separate from the church that is neither Jew nor Gentile that began there in Acts, even though it was racially Jewish and became more characterized by a Gentile audience. The distinction that the hyper-dispensationalist would make there would actually alienate the Jewish Christian from participation in what we are in today as Gentile believers. And so they would often do away with the ordinance of water baptism and say that that's also not relevant anymore because that took place earlier in Acts, and we don't see that carried on later. And so you've got mid-acts, late-acts, dispensationalists. That, again, that's all in the camp of hyper-dispensationalism, something to be avoided. The extreme would be really placing, and this is something that has also carried over onto or fallen on the backs of dispensationalists when covenantalists would try to cast accusation because they have problems with dispensational distinctions. What they're typically reacting to is this hyper dispensationalism, or this seeing distinctions everywhere and making those lines so deep, and so building those walls so high that no one can get around them, and that you do away with the unity because of the distinction. And what is so important as we look at the scriptures is that we both recognize the distinctions and the similarities. That one does not dismiss the other, but we must recognize both together. Well, I think that should suffice for now. That'll give you an idea of the theological landscape out there and some of the things we'll be looking at. As you know, at the end of this week, you'll be submitting your final paper, your term paper on dispensational theology. So I look forward to reading and receiving that from you. And God bless you as you finish up your studies in this course. It's been a pleasure.